Children usually bring out people's protective instincts, triggering a natural desire to treat them kindly. Throughout history, however, many unfortunate children, whether through ignorance, indifference, or deliberate malice, were unprotected, treated unkindly, or both. Take the health fad that got people to dangle babies from cages outside apartment windows in the belief that it was good for them, or the many royal children whose existence blocked somebody's path to power. Following are 20 things about those and other unfortunate children. Number 20. The unfortunate toddler whose cuteness got him kidnapped by the Nazis. In 1941, Hitler ordered a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The following year, as German tanks plunged deeper into the USSR, they were followed closely by Nazi officials, tasked with administering the newly conquered territories. In the Crimea, they encountered a blonde toddler named Alexander Litau, who possessed striking blue eyes. The kid's cuteness attracted not only admiring looks from mothers, but also from SS men who thought that he represented the ideal of what an Aryan child should look like. Little Alexander's cuteness was a blessing, but when the Nazis came across him, it became a decided curse, as the SS saw it. Leaving what they viewed as a perfect Aryan specimen in the middle of a sea of inferior Slavs amounted to a crime against the Germanic race, so they snatched the unfortunate kid from his family and shipped him to Germany in order to enroll him in the Lebensborn program, Germanize him, and see to it that he was raised as a German. Number 19. This kidnapped toddler became a literal Nazi poster child. Photos of Alexander Litau made their way to Heinrich Himmler. The SS chief was captivated by the cute kid and ordered that he be subjected an extra rigorous battery of racial testing to ensure that there was no Jewish trace in his background. When Himmler was finally satisfied that the kid was pure Aryan, he personally oversaw his adoption by a wealthy and fanatical Nazi named Adalbert Heineck. In his new home, the unfortunate Alexander was renamed Volker Heineck. His photos were released to the public as the poster child of an ideal Nazi toddler's appearance. When he was in his late 60s, the abducted Crimean kid recalled seeing Himmler when he visited his home and had drinks with his father. Volker's first inkling of his background came after the war, when a local child taunted him, "You know you're a bastard, don't you? They're not your real mom and dad." He never discussed it with his parents, who, although they remained unreformed Nazi fanatics to their dying day, nonetheless loved him dearly. After their deaths, Volker spent much of his adulthood in a quest to discover who he was. The quest, which finally led him to his Crimean origins, became the subject of a BBC documentary. Number 18. America's child soldiers. The United States Civil War was the last conflict in which significant numbers of American children served as soldiers. About a fifth of all military personnel in the Civil War were under 18, and more than 100,000 soldiers in the Union Army alone were 15 years old or less. There were even cases in which children as young as 8 were put in uniform. Most U.S. Army child soldiers were utilized as drummers, buglers, cook's assistants, nurses, orderlies, general gophers, or in other non-combatant positions. However, during battles, those children were often just as exposed to bullets and artillery as were the grown men on the firing line. In the U.S. Navy, children often served as powder monkeys in warships, tasked during combat with rushing gunpowder from magazines to cannons. They were just as exposed to danger during action as were all other sailors aboard ship, regardless of age. Indeed, as they scurried about toting sacks of gunpowder that could go off if they came into contact with any spark or shard of flaming timber or scorching shell fragment, the little powder monkeys might have been at greater risk than the rest of the crew. Number 17. The Civil War's youngest child soldier. Born in 1853, Edward William Black was the youngest child soldier known to have served during the Civil War. He also holds the unfortunate distinction of being the youngest known soldier to have been injured during the conflict, joining the 21st Indiana Infantry Regiment in 1861 when he was 8. Edward served as a drummer in that regiment. Sent home after a few months, he returned this time with his father and re-enlisted in the regiment as a drummer boy. During the war, Edward traveled widely throughout the United as the 21st Indiana's drummer. Early in his service, he served in the regiment as at Garrison, Baltimore. He then accompanied the 21st Indiana on an expedition to the Eastern Shore, and from there to Newport News, Virginia, before getting shipped to serve in the Department of the Gulf. There, the young lad's unit fought in Louisiana as part of the campaign that resulted in the Union's capture of New Orleans. Number 16. A young child soldier's extensive service. In 1862, Confederates captured Edward Black during the Battle of Baton Rouge, and he was imprisoned in Ship Island However, he regained his liberty when federal troops overtook his captors and freed the Union prisoners soon thereafter. In September 1862, Edward was discharged from the Union Army. He did not stay out of uniform for long, however. Edward re-enlisted in February 1863 with his old unit, which in the interval between his discharge and re-enlistment had been converted from infantry to artillery. The 21st Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment was reconstituted as the 1st Indiana Heavy Artillery Regiment. Edward returned to his old comrades and served with them as the regiment was kept busy until war's end. During that time, Edward saw active duty in Barrack Bay and took part in operations in western Louisiana. He also participated in the advance on and subsequent siege of Port Hudson, joined the Sabine Pass expedition, and finally settled in for garrison duty, first at New Orleans and then at Baton Rouge. Number 15. Gaining the unfortunate distinction of being the youngest soldier injured during the Civil War. During his extensive service, Edward Black was wounded more than once. In one instance, when he was 12 years old, he was grievously injured when an exploding shell shattered his left hand and arm. The injuries earned Edward the unfortunate distinction of being the youngest Civil War soldier injured on active duty. At war's end, Edward and his unit remained in Baton Rouge as garrison troops until January 1866, when the 1st Indiana Heavy Artillery was finally mustered out, and its personnel were discharged. Edward Black never fully recovered from the injuries he received during the war, nor from the mental trauma of what he had been exposed to at such a tender age. He died in 1872, when he was 17 and was buried in Indianapolis. His drum was passed on down his family over the generations, before it was finally gifted to the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. There, it remains on display to this day as one of the museum's most prized and popular exhibits. Number 14. The children of the Second Boer War. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902. Britain had a rough go of it trying to subdue the Boers of the Orange Free State and of the Republic of Transvaal. The British initially assumed that the fighting would be quickly over after a swift campaign, but their opponents proved tougher than expected. Although greatly outnumbered, the Boers went on the offensive and achieved some remarkable early successes. Before they knew it, the British had a full-scale war on their hands that required the commitment of roughly 600,000 troops and auxiliaries to the fight. The Boers' numerical inferiority forced to avoid pitched battles and rely instead on hit-and-run tactics and guerrilla warfare that flustered the British. In late 1900, Herbert Kitchener was put in charge of the British effort, and he proceeded to defeat the guerrillas by depriving them of the civilian support upon which they relied. The British adopted a scorched earth policy of burning down Boer farms and homesteads, killing their livestock, poisoning their wells, destroying their crops, and salting their fields. By the time the British were done, tens of thousands of civilians, mostly women and children, had perished. Things got worse when the British rounded up Boer civilians and sent them to concentration camps. Number 13. The unfortunate children of Britain's concentration camps. In addition to their scorched earth policy, the British adopted an ominous innovation recently introduced by the Spanish. While suppressing guerrillas in their Cuban colony, concentration camps, tens of thousands of Boer civilians from the countryside, mostly women and children, were rounded up and in turn thus literally concentrated in vast camps behind barbed wire. Conditions in the camps were atrocious. The administrators were incompetent, supplies were spotty, and the internees suffered from bad sanitation, poor hygiene, overcrowding, inadequate shelter, often non-existent medical care, and hunger. Food was scant, and the British targeted the families of Boer men who were still fighting, giving them even smaller rations than the meager portions provided the rest. Malnutrition killed many internees and left many more vulnerable to contagious diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and measles. Roughly 115,000 Boer women and children were herded into 45 concentration camps. In the 11 months from June 1901 to May 1902, about 28,000 Boer internees, a tenth of the population, died. The Boers' African servants were held in separate concentration camps, where conditions were even worse. Those camps did not garner the same attention as the camps housing the white Boers, but an estimated 20,000 Africans perished in them. Number 12. History's most dysfunctional dynasty. In the annals of history, few ruling families have been as dysfunctional, perverse, or given to more intrafamilial murders than the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt from 323 to 30 BC. All 15 kings were named Ptolemy, numbered I through 15, and of the Ptolemaic queens there were 7 Cleopatras and 4 Berenices. The family had a tradition of incestuous marriages, mostly with brothers marrying sisters, with the occasional uncle, niece, and nephew aunt weddings. There was also at least one possible mother-son marriage thrown into the mix. In addition to marrying their close relatives, the Ptolemies were also into murdering each other, and their history abounds with them killing their brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews, and even mothers. One of the more unfortunate Ptolemaic intrafamilial murders was that of the child king Ptolemy VII, died circa 145 BC. The events leading up to it began when the neighboring Seleucid king Antiochus IV captured Alexandria and made King Ptolemy VI his puppet. The Alexandrians rioted and chose the puppet king's obese younger brother Ptolemy VIII Physcon, or Ptolemy Potbelly, as monarch. After the Seleucids were forced out of Egypt by Roman threats, Ptolemy Potbelly agreed to a three-way joint rule with his brother Ptolemy VI and their sister Cleopatra II, who was also Ptolemy VI's wife. Number 11. It was unfortunate for this child king that his mother trusted his uncle's stepfather, who was also her brother husband. The three-way joint rule agreement of Ptolemy VI, his wife's sister Cleopatra II, and their brother Ptolemy VIII Potbelly was complicated and icky. It did not take long for the situation to get even more complicated and icky, and for the deal to collapse. It was an unstable arrangement that lent itself to intrigues, conspiracies, betrayals, and further destabilized Egypt. Ptolemy Potbelly was not in Egypt when his brother Ptolemy VI died in 145 BC. Their sister Cleopatra II, the deceased king's wife, promptly declared her child son as King Ptolemy VII. When Potbelly returned, he convinced his widowed sister to marry him instead, and promised that the sibling spouses would rule jointly. It was unfortunate for the child king Ptolemy VII that his mother trusted her brother husband to keep his word. Ptolemy Potbelly double-crossed his sister new wife in the worst way possible. During their wedding feast, Potbelly had his new wife's son and his nephew, Ptolemy VII, murdered. He also reneged on the promise to rule jointly with his sister wife, and declared himself sole ruler. Number 10. This king not only did in his nephew's stepson, but also dumped his sister wife to marry her daughter. Understandably, Cleopatra II was steaming mad that her husband brother Ptolemy Potbelly had murdered her unfortunate son and reneged on his promise to share the rule of Egypt with her. Then Ptolemy Potbelly made things worse by seducing and marrying Cleopatra II's daughter, Cleopatra III. She was his stepdaughter, as well as double niece, being the daughter of both his sister Cleopatra II and his deceased brother Ptolemy VI. Adding insult to injury, Potbelly did not bother to divorce Cleopatra II before marrying her daughter. Cleopatra II retaliated by engineering an uprising that forced her brother husband son-in-law and his stepdaughter niece wife to flee Alexandria in 132 BC. The resultant civil war pitted Cleopatra II, supported by the city of Alexandria, against her daughter and Ptolemy Potbelly, who had the backing of the rest of Egypt. When things turned against Cleopatra II, she offered her throne to the neighboring Seleucids, but their armies were unable to rescue her, and she was forced to flee to Syria in 127 BC. Chaos reigned in Egypt until Rome intervened once again in 116 BC to restore order. Number 9. The murderous Ptolemaic dynasty ended with the murder of two unfortunate children. The reign of Cleopatra VII, the Ptolemaic dynasty's most famous ruler, and the last one who wielded actual power, was rife with the Ptolemies' typical intrigues, betrayals, and perversions, carrying on the family's tradition of incest. She married her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. The sibling spouses fell out, however, and plunged Egypt into a civil war. It ended with Cleopatra's henchmen killing her unfortunate kid brother. After Julius Caesar intervened and took her side, she then married another kid brother, Ptolemy XIV, while carrying on an affair with Caesar. Cleopatra bore the Roman dictator a son, Caesarion, the future Ptolemy XV, the dynasty's last nominal ruler. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra took up with his chief lieutenant, Mark Antony, with whom she had one of history's most famous love affairs. The couple were eventually defeated by Antony's rival, Gaius Octavius, the future Emperor Augustus. Antony fell on his sword, and Cleopatra committed suicide via snakebite in 30 BC. She was nominally succeeded by Ptolemy XV Caesarion, and Augustus had the 16-year-old killed. When he was captured a few weeks later, the deaths of Cleopatra and Caesarion brought the Ptolemaic dynasty to an end, and Egypt was made into a Roman province. Number 8. A Roman father could legally kill his children, or sell them into slavery. Modern sensibilities would be shocked by the degree of authority that a Roman head of household or paterfamilias exercised over his family. The lower end of the spectrum, Roman law and tradition granted the family patriarch the power to reject or approve the marriages of his sons and daughters. At the more extreme end, those laws and traditions granted Roman patriarchs a literal power of life and death over their family. In some instances, such as when it came to deformed babies, Roman law mandated that the patriarch put to death infants with obvious deformities. Roman law also granted fathers the right to sell their children into slavery. It typically happened only in dire circumstances, when hard-pressed patriarchs sought to ease their burdens. While the practice was not widespread, it did take place from time to time. However, and for what it was worth for the unfortunate kids, their father's right to sell them was not absolute. He could only do so a maximum of 3 times, assuming the kids regained their freedom after each occurrence, before the thrice enslaved kids were freed from his familial authority for good. Number 7. Augustus killed his infant great-grandson. Despite the ancient Romans' reputation for licentiousness, debauchery and wild orgies, they indulged in such carnal excesses while simultaneously frowning upon adultery, not just on moral grounds, but also because it introduced the possibility of illegitimate heirs to a paterfamilia's estate. When Augustus became emperor, he sought to restore traditional values with a slate of morality laws aimed at combating adultery, defined as a woman having relations with a man who was not her husband. A man having relations with female slaves and prostitutes did not count. One of Augustus' morality laws codified a father's traditional rights regarding an adulterous daughter. He could legally kill his daughter, as well as her lover, whether in his own house or that of his son-in-law. Ironically, Augustus' own daughter, Julia the Elder, ran afoul of the anti-adultery laws. He did not kill her, but to save face, he exiled her in 2 BC, first to a small island, then to a tiny village in the toe of Italy. She remained in exile for the rest of her life. In 8 AD, Augustus' granddaughter, Julia the Younger, also got caught up in an adultery scandal with a Roman senator. He had her exiled to a remote island, where she gave birth to a love child. Augustus ordered the unfortunate infant exposed. Number 6. The child who had an unfortunate and brief life despite, or because of being the son of a Roman emperor. Tiberius Claudius Caesar Britannicus, usually referred to as Britannicus, was the son of the Roman Emperor Claudius and his third wife, Valeria Messalina. Being born the son of a Roman emperor should have been fortunate, the equivalent of hitting the birth lottery. In Britannicus' case, it was but not for long. He was Claudius' heir for a while, but in 48 AD it was discovered that Britannicus' mother Messalina had been cheating on her husband nonstop. Messalina went so far as to get bigamously married to another man in secret. Britannicus' mother was Emperor Augustus' great-grandniece, and was also a cousin of Emperors Caligula and Nero, along with Augustus' daughter Julia, who was banished by her father for promiscuity. Contemporary writers described Messalina as one of the most notoriously promiscuous women in Roman history. Understandably, when Claudius found out, he was not happy. Messalina's subsequent downfall was unfortunate for Britannicus. Number 5. The rise of Britannicus' mother. The path of Britannicus' mother to becoming a Roman empress began in 37 AD. That year, the future Emperor Claudius picked Valeria Messalina, who was 30 years younger than him, to be his third wife. As with many unions between young women and significantly older men, it was not a great marriage. Aside from the age difference, Claudius was not a physically appealing man. He limped, stuttered, and drooled. Those shortcomings had led the imperial family to sideline him as an embarrassment and borderline idiot. Claudius was no idiot, however. He was a scholar and the Roman equivalent of a nerd. Still, he was not exactly the type to set pretty girls' hearts aflutter. Thus, his marriage to the young and pretty Messalina proved disastrous. Claudius doted on his younger wife, and she used her physical allure to wrap him around her finger. When Claudius became emperor in 41, Messalina got him to execute or exile anybody who displeased her. A whole lot of people displeased Messalina, including Claudius himself. Such undercurrents of his parents' relationship proved fatal to Britannicus. Number 4. The downfall of Britannicus' mother. Messalina despised her husband and cheated on him nonstop, brazenly so. In one instance during her marriage to Claudius, salacious contemporary accounts had her winning a competition with a prostitute to see who could sleep with the most people in one night. Messalina's most infamous affair was with a senator, Gaius Silius. She plotted with him to murder Claudius, so Silius could replace him on the throne. Considering the recklessness with which she went about it, Messalina might have been a bit unhinged. While Claudius was out of Rome, his wife married Silius and celebrated it with a huge banquet. Claudius rushed back to Rome, confirmed the affair and had her executed. Claudius had terrible luck when it came to marriage. He had divorced his first wife, Placia Urgulanilla, for adultery after she became pregnant by one of Claudius' freedmen. She was also suspected of having murdering her sister-in-law. His second marriage, to Aelia Paetina, also ended in divorce, because she abused him mentally and physically. Claudius' first two wives cheated on or abused him, but at least they had not tried to murder him. His third wife did. That was most unfortunate for Britannicus, who was still a child when his mother tried to kill his father. Number 3. The unfortunate Britannicus was poisoned by his stepbrother, shortly after his stepmother had poisoned his father. Messalina seemingly slept with half of Rome, publicly wed another man while still married to Claudius, and plotted with her lover and bigamous husband to murder her imperial hubby and usurp his throne. That marriage ended in Messalina's execution. An incorrigible optimist, Claudius married for a fourth time, this time wedding his niece Agrippina Minor, 33 years Claudius Jr. Agrippina was the granddaughter of Emperor Augustus, and the younger sister of Emperor Caligula. At age 13, she married a cousin, Cneius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and bore him a son, the future Emperor Nero. Ahenobarbus died in 41 AD, and when Claudius executed Messalina in 48 AD, he chose Agrippina as his fourth wife. The marriage ended with her poisoning him to death. She convinced Claudius to adopt her son, Nero, and make him his heir and successor instead of his biological son with Messalina. Britannicus. By 54 AD, Claudius seemed to have had second thoughts about marrying Agrippina, and began favoring Britannicus and preparing him for the throne. So Agrippina poisoned Claudius at a banquet with a plate of deadly mushrooms. For the remainder of her life, she jokingly referred to mushrooms as the food of the gods, because Roman emperors were deified as gods after their deaths, and by killing Claudius, mushrooms had made him a god. Shortly after Nero ascended the throne, they had the unfortunate Britannicus, then 13 years old, poisoned. Number 2. A social program that cynically exploited unfortunate orphans. The Catholic Church used to hold significant, and sometimes pernicious, sway over Quebec, until the mid-20th century. The 1940s and 1950s in particular were an era of widespread poverty, few social services, and church predominance. In those dark days, Maurice Duplessis, a strict Catholic politician, became Quebec's premier. He immediately placed the province's schools, orphanages, and hospitals in the hands of various Catholic religious orders. Duplessis then hatched a scheme with church authorities to gain the Canadian federal government's subsidy assistance program to the provinces. The idea was to divert as many taxpayer dollars as possible into the coffers of Quebec's Catholic Church. Canada's federal subsidy program incentivized healthcare and the building of hospitals, more so than other social programs and infrastructures. Provinces received a federal contribution of about $1.25 a day for every orphan, but more than twice that, $2.75 for every psychiatric patient. So Duplessis and Quebec's Catholic Church hit upon the idea of transforming $1.25 a day orphans into more profitable $2.75 a day psychiatric patients, as seen below. That was terrible news for thousands of Quebecois orphans. Number 1. A vile politician and vile clergyman deliberately misdiagnosed unfortunate orphans as psychiatric patients to make money. To exploit the Canadian federal government's subsidy program, Maurice Duplessis and Quebec's Catholic Church conspired to turn unfortunate orphans into psychiatric patients. To implement their idea, they set up a system to falsely diagnose orphans as mentally deficient, in order to siphon more federal subsidy dollars into the church's coffers. As a first step, Duplessis signed an order that instantly turned Quebec's orphanages into hospitals. That entitled their religious order administrators, and ultimately the Catholic Church of Quebec, to receive the higher subsidy rates for hospitals. It took decades before the scandalous state of affairs was finally uncovered. By then, over 20,000 otherwise mentally sound Quebecois orphans had been misdiagnosed with psychiatric ailments. Once they were misdiagnosed, the orphans were declared mentally deficient. It was not just a paperwork technicality. Once they were misdiagnosed as mentally deficient, the orphan's schooling stopped, and they became inmates in poorly supervised mental institutions. There, the unfortunate children were often subjected physical, mental, and other abuse by nuns and lay monitors.